Okay, so looks like it is actually recording. So let's try this one again. So the second and third topics that we're going to discuss within our resistance to globalization topic is we're going to look at two political or protest movements, and we're also going to look at art. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico. I had never heard of the Zapatistas until I was a senior in college, and I was taking this course called Culture, Power, and Development. And we watched a documentary called A Place Called Chiapas. And it was obviously the first time I had heard of Zapatistas, and it was also the first time that I'd ever heard of Chiapas, the southernmost state in Mexico. And um, the first time that I'd also been exposed to NAFTA as maybe something that wasn't beneficial, right? And as an American, I think we're kind of used to this idea that these trade agreements are beneficial for us. And the idea that they could not be beneficial to other people was something very foreign to me. So let's talk about the Zapatistas. All right. So in southern Mexico, the southernmost state is called Chiapas. And Chiapas is very rural. It's very densely wooded, forested. It's pretty jungly there. It's very rich in natural resources. But the people there are very poor, and they also coincidentally are mostly indigenous Mayan. So there are not a lot of people of Spanish descent in Chiapas. They have the highest rates within Mexico of malnutrition, maternal mortality, and illiteracy, right? So Chiapas is not doing very well. And in the 1980s, there starts to be some violent conflict over land rights. And so the group, or a lot of the native people, form this group, the Zapatistas, in the mid 1980s, 1983, and they decide that on January 1st, 1994, the day that NAFTA goes into effect, they will make their declaration of war. So they are named after Emilio Zapata, who was a hero from the Mexican Revolution, who really preached about land and freedom. And what's unique about the Zapatista movement is that it is a poor people's revolt without communism. So these people are not Leninists, they are not Marxists, they are not Maoists. Right, I said they have one of the highest rates of illiteracy, so it's not like they've been studying and preparing for a communist revolution. These are just people who want access to the land that they live on. And one of the things as to why this is happening, so Chiapas, because it is kind of so rural and excluded, a lot of the land reform that takes place because of the Mexican Revolution doesn't make its way down to Chiapas. So it's still very much haunted by the encomienda system and by colonialism. And that's part of why these people, who are mostly of indigenous descent, did not have the opportunity to kind of reap the benefits of a modern Mexico. And this is exacerbated, it's made worse um, by NAFTA, because northern Mexico, which becomes much more industrialized and has a lot more access to trade and interaction with the United States, starts to become richer, have more concentrations of wealth. And so we see Chiapas being left behind. So, back to kind of the future, I guess. On January 1st, 1994, the Zapatistas occupy 7 towns, including the tourist center of San Cristobal de las Casas. Uh, and that's where Subcomandante Marcos, who you see here, such an epic name, Subcomandante Marcos. He's always kind of like riding this little pony in his battle fatigues with his bullets, wearing a mask and smoking a pipe. He always looks this way in like every photo I've seen. In that documentary, A Place Called Chiapas, he's like having this formal television interview, and he still has his mask on and is smoking his pipe. No one really knows who he is, which is fascinating. But anyway, so right. They occupy 7 towns, including San Cristobal de las Casas, and Subcomando de Marcos reads their declaration of war and talks about what their demands are. Their demands are equal access to the land. They want redistribution of land. They want more rights for Chiapas, more autonomy for it. And then they kind of just like meld back into the jungle. In the years since 1994, they have taken over large ranches and reapportioned them to landless peasants. They have demanded those indigenous rights for more autonomy. And we have also seen this huge growth, like we see over here, in the involvement of women. And therefore, women's rights in Chiapas have really become much more exposed and much more accessible because women played such an important role in the movement. So the other political movement that we're going to work with is what's called the Battle in Seattle, which takes place in December of 1999. So in December of 1989, the World Trade Organization is having a conference of its ministers. So the World Trade Organization is an international, actually, it's an NGO, it's a non-governmental organization in which there are member states. So your country petitions to join the World Trade Organization. And the way that it works is it is a forum for countries to voice complaints when they feel that trade is unfair. So, for example, in the 1990s, actually for decades leading up to that, Jamaica had had an exclusive banana trading relationship with the United Kingdom. It was kind of a, hey, sorry about the whole colonialism thing, we'll buy your bananas. And so other banana companies, Dole, Chiquita, etc., could not sell their bananas in the United Kingdom. They had no access to the British market. So in the 90s, Dole and Chiquita go to President Bill Clinton and they say, hey, this is unfair. We have no access to the market, to the British market. That's a huge market. We don't have access. We can't sell any bananas because of this stupid policy that the British have. So President Clinton goes to the World Trade Organization and he says, that's unfair trade. You can't have this exclusive trade relationship. It's not cool. And so the World Trade Organization rules in favor of Dole and Chiquita. Dole and Chiquita get access to British markets. Dole and Chiquita grow bananas on an industrial scale. Most of Jamaica's bananas are grown by small farmers, so they just can't compete. And the Jamaican bananas basically disappear from British shelves, and the Jamaican banana industry collapses. So that's one of the bad things that happens. But the way that it works, right, the forum where you could be like, hey, this isn't fair, or hey, this is unsafe, or what have you, that's the way that the World Trade Organization works. So in December of 1989, they're having this conference based on globalization. And so in response to this conference, 40,000 protesters gather in the city of Seattle. Um, and at the time, and then as the years have gone on, they are definitely mocked as these kind of like silly, aimless, overly upset protesters. Um, but let's talk about who they are. So we see that they're organized by various groups, and that might be why it was so messy. But unions are there who are worried about cheap foreign labor and so how globalization will impact the labor market. Environmentalists are there who are worried about how corporations, as they grow more powerful, will exploit the environment. Consumer protection groups are there who are worried that as corporations become more powerful, they will kind of create products that are maybe less safe. Labor rights groups are there, making sure that, that their voice is heard about how we can make sure that if you are a worker in Bangladesh or in a factory in China or Vietnam or what have you, that you're working in safe conditions. And there's also a large contingent of just basically leftists who are angry about capitalism. And what they were trying to do is they're trying to demonstrate for us the dark sides of globalization. And on some facts, like they're not wrong. because of globalization, it has been empirically data proven that American unemployment did increase, right? Particularly during the late 70s and 1980s, because of the deindustrialization of America and the shipment of those jobs overseas. Wages did increase decrease in the United States because they had to compete with foreign markets. Speaking of that competition, the American economy has seen growing competition from developing countries. And so I think what these protesters wanted us to ask is what is the cost of cheaper goods, right? What is the cost of made in China? I think that's part of what we have to ask ourselves as we continue on in this very globalized world. So the last thing we're going to talk about is art as resistance. So where we're going to go is we're going to go to the Pacific Islands where we haven't spent a lot of time. And before you're like, Miss Oliva, why is there a metal cow? Here's why. So this is called Pisupo Lua Afe. It's by a guy named Michael Tuffery. And it is a metal cow. Technically, it's a metal bowl. He is made of corned beef cans. It will become clear why soon. So, pea soupo is like a Samoan American version of pea soup. See, pea soupo, pea soup. Mm. And pea soup is the first canned good to be imported into the Pacific. During and after World War II, we see this huge influx of canned foods into the Pacific. It's brought by American GIs. It's brought just by like increase in trade and globalization. And so now this term pea soupo is just a generic catch-all for any kind of canned food. So the same way you would use Kleenex to represent all brands of tissue, that same thing. So pea soupo is any kind of canned food. And the canned food that we are talking about, the pea soupo lua afe, is canned corned beef, which is what this bowl is made of. So the canned corned beef, he literally is a canned corned beef. Haha, get it? Okay, but like why? So Michael Tuffery is mostly Samoan. He has other kinds of Pacific Island in his background, but he is mostly Samoan. And American Samoa, right, is an American like Commonwealth. Technically, I guess it's part of the Commonwealth. It's kind of like an American colony. And as he grew up, what he noticed was that the diet and culture of the Pacific, we'll say American Samoa, changed drastically. So their diet went from being mostly fresh, seafood based to being canned food based. So canned corned beef, canned tuna, spam, right? If you've been to Hawaii, then you know spam is like this huge deal. Well, like, why? Also, canned tuna is huge in the Pacific, but like most of the tuna that you eat for sushi comes from the Pacific. So, like, why aren't they eating their own fresh caught tuna? Why are they eating canned processed tuna that comes shipped in shipping containers? Um, these are important questions that we have to ask, and it's part of why he made this canned corned beef, right? So, canned corned beef has become so important in Samoan and other Pacific Island culture that it's a present that you give. So, like if you go to weddings or coming of age parties or funerals, you can bring gifts of canned corned beef. And here's kind of the problem with these processed foods, like canned corned beef in particular. They're high in saturated fat, they're high in salt and sodium, they're high in cholesterol. And as diets have shifted to these processed foods, we've seen high rates of diabetes and heart disease in the Pacific, whereas we never saw these diseases in the Pacific before. And these diets have changed because of globalization and because of the access of corporations to Pacific cultures and of Pacific cultures to these corporations. We've also seen the Pacific Islands themselves change because of the introduction of cattle like this guy, right? Cattle are not native to the Pacific Islands, and they really change the environment of the Pacific Islands when they're there. So what we've kind of seen is this growth and exploitation of Pacific resources. And the Pacific themselves, they don't have the strength or the size to compete, right? They don't have the ability to say no to a trade deal because they need it. They so desperately need it because there are so few resources on some of these islands and they're so small. So that's why there is this canned corned beef bowl, um, to draw our attention to all of those layers. So if you were a Pacific Islander, these things would be much more obvious to you. We have to have them explained to us because we are not Pacific Islanders. But right, I think they're important to recognize nonetheless how an artist like Michael Tuffery can use um, these types of products, uh, these types of ideas within his art to resist globalization itself.